in the neurodiverse brain, dopamine is needed. And so you have to do something to create the dopamine, and motivation is one of the things that creates dopamine in the brain, which enables it to be easier to do things that are non-preferred things.
When it comes to neurodivergent brains, motivation isn't quite as simple as it seems. Why do traditional approaches often fall short? And what's really going on when someone appears unmotivated? Today, we're talking with Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster, authors of The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More. They're hosts of the Parenting with Impact podcast and experts in raising complex kids. We'll dive into the delicate balance of building motivation while understanding how executive function shapes the neurodivergent mind. That's straight ahead on episode 249. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
It's hard to believe that my new book with co-author Amanda Morin will be released in just a little over 2 months. Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices So All Students Feel Accepted and Supported, is a book that outlines the systemic changes our educational institutions need to make to create environments that allow all students and neurotypes to thrive. There are some cool things that are going to happen along with the launch, and we would love for you to be a part of all of them. If you want to stay in the loop, take a few minutes and follow the Neurodiversity Podcast social media feeds on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Or if you want to be sure that you are one of the first to get your hands on a copy of this book, it's available for pre-order on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Target. You can find all the links in the show notes. We appreciate you being along with us on this journey. Okay, my conversation with Elaine and Diane is up next.
previously on the Neurodiversity podcast.
One example that crossed my mind was from my own neurodivergent autistic daughter, who's 25. And a couple of years ago, we were talking about Christmas, and she said something about the hardest part of Christmas morning. And I said, what are you talking about? What's hard on Christmas morning? That's just fun. And she said, you know, when you open a present and you have to remember to put a happy face on. And I said, do you mean like if you don't like the present, you don't want to hurt the person's feelings? She said, no, even if it's a great present that you love, you have to remember to put the happy face on. You know what I mean? And I said, no, I'm not autistic, by the way. No, I don't know what you mean. Like for me, my face just does what it's going to do. And in moments like that, I don't have to consciously put a happy face on.
That's episode 216. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today I have two guests with me.
I'm Diane.
And I'm Elaine.
Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster are the hosts of the Parenting with Impact podcast and authors of several books, including Parenting ADHD Now and The Essential Guide to Raising Complex Kids with ADHD, Anxiety, and More. Thank you both for taking the time to talk to me today.
It is great to be here. Thanks for having us.
I want to start us off and just recognize the fact that there are so many people who work with neurodivergent young people, whether they are parents or professionals. And one of the things that they often struggle with is the fact that traditional advice for working with children in general often doesn't apply to neurodivergent kids. And I would love for you to just share a little bit about that. I mean, does that make sense to you that it doesn't always resonate? Is that something that you've seen in your work? And why is that?
I mean, this is why we do what we do, is because we were both moms we were professional moms, but we were doing what the experts told us to do, and it wasn't working for our, quirky, complex kids. And when that happens, it makes you feel worse as a parent, makes you really worry about your kids, like all of this cascading impact that does not help the situation. And I think they're well-meaning experts giving well-meaning advice that doesn't always compute or translate well.
Well, and part of that is because it's not designed with neurodiversity in mind, right? And I think that that's the piece of it, is that there are differences when you have a child with executive function challenges. I'm going to use that terminology specifically, that the things that we expect will happen when we parent in a certain way literally don't play out the same way. Consequences is a great example. We expect that a consequence is going to help our child to learn to not make the same mistake over and over again. And those of you who have complex kids know, you could take away an Xbox for the rest of a kid's life, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to learn how to get off the computer effectively, right? It's just sort of, those two are technically unrelated, but we try to merge them together, and our kids really don't have the skills it takes to engage with the parenting models in the same way as they were designed. I don't know how else to say that, Elaine. Would you say it differently?
No, I think it's on target. And, what's coming up for me, Emily, as I hear Diane speaking is I remember the moment when my eldest kid was somewhere around 8 or 10. I had 3 small children under the age of 10 with neurodivergence. I didn't even know what the term meant at that time, much less the term executive function. And I remember being at a parenting specialist, parenting lecture at my kid's school. And it was Wendy Mogul, whom I adored, and I loved her book, The Blessings of a Skinned Knee. And she was talking about accountability. And I raised my hand and I said, well, what if your kid has special needs? And she looked at me straight on and she said, well, then this doesn't apply to you. Mm. And I remember thinking, well, if this doesn't apply to me, then what does? And that, it was actually liberating because it gave me permission to say, okay, I need to find another way because what I'm doing isn't working. And that's when I discovered coaching, the coach approach, and, everything unfolded from there. But I needed that permission because I kept trying to be a good mom doing what they told me to do.
Mm-hmm. It's such a gift that you got that, Elaine. And I don't know that most parents get that, because I don't know that if you don't have a complex kid, if you don't have a kid who has executive function challenges, our tendency is to just do more of the same and expect that I've got to do more and eventually it'll work. And it's like, at some point you have to say, really, this isn't working. And if you really understand the challenges that are going on for your kids and what's underneath their challenges, there's like this light bulb that goes off and goes, oh, of course, this kid has working memory issues. He's not going to remember.
Right.
He's not going to remember that he's going to get in trouble if he pulls the dog's tail or whatever it is that they're going to get in trouble for. I mean, they literally don't have the ability to remember those sorts of things.
I always go back to the fact that so many adults who are neurodivergent were raised before we had any real strategies. They probably weren't even labeled at the time. So I always go back to the fact that I was one of the few women my age who was diagnosed as ADHD as a child, but didn't mean I had any help. It's like they still kept doing the same things. It was like I had some medication, but at least I had that self-understanding on some level that my brain is different.
Yeah, and I was one that was not diagnosed until I was 41 years old.
Yeah.
And the result of that was that I grew up believing that I was lazy, crazy, or stupid. Mm-hmm. Even though they told me I was smart and even I internalized this belief that if I can't get myself to do what they expect me to do, or it's really hard for me to do what they expect me to do, that must mean I'm lazy, crazy, or stupid.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you guys are adding another layer to this, which there's this generational thing that's happened over the last 20 or 30 years in parenting as well. And I have a lot of parents who say, well, yeah, I had ADHD when I was a kid, but I would have never done anything like this. And when you poke at it, it's really because it was a generation of parents, or maybe 7 generations of parents, that used fear as a parenting tool, right? And as a society, that's not a tool that most of us now are willing to pull out. And it probably created more harm than good in the day, but it did get kids. And, my ex-husband would say this, my partner would say this, it's like, it got them to get stuff done, but it doesn't mean that it didn't do it without a cost.
I was going to say, but the cost was relationship, the cost was self-esteem. There were all kinds of other resulting impacts from that.
Yeah.
I would think one of the pieces that I'd really love to focus on with both of you today is about motivation, specifically with neurodivergent kids. Because when we look at that, one of the common ways that we often try to motivate kids is through some of these consequences or rewards or all of these different pieces that just really aren't always effective. And, motivation for neurodivergent people of all ages can be really tricky to harness. I often have people ask me for ideas or advice about helping the young people in their life because they're just quote unquote unmotivated. I don't know that I've ever met a child who really is unmotivated. It's more that they are perhaps not motivated in the ways that we would like them to be motivated.
I always like to start any conversation about motivation with awareness that may not be what is really going on. And a lot of times parents will say, he's just not motivated. She's just not motivated. And the reality is that a lot of times our kids really secretly are, but they don't know how to do whatever it is, or they have executive function delays. And so they're having a hard time doing the things that even they want to be able to do.
Yes.
Or they've lost confidence over time. And so they become demotivated just because, why should I bother? Everybody's going to be mad at me and frustrated with me anyway. And so to start with, not just assuming that it's about motivation, but that there might be something else going on about it. And if you can uncover that there is an issue of motivation there, and motivation is so important. And if you've got a neurodivergent kid, but don't just start there. And so I think that there's kind of two parts of the conversation. Elaine, you look like you want to jump in.
Yes, there are two parts. Like there's understanding what's really going on. And then there's how do you help rally and instigate and enroll kids in their own motivation. But, to your point, Diane, it's not that they're not motivated. In fact, they are always motivated. They just may be motivated to be doing something different at that moment. I might be motivated to be on my screen, or to be talking to my friends, or to be, fill in the blank of a million things that they're doing instead of doing what's expected of them. Mm-hmm. And so understanding that it's not that they're not motivated, it's that something else has them more motivated than whatever it is you're wanting them to be motivated.
Or has their attention even, because a lot of times it's not even conscious, right? It's not, when we say motivation, it's like, I like playing games more than I like doing my homework, but most kids want to do their homework and they want to play. They want both. And so it's not more or less, it's really just more what's in their face kind of thing.
Yeah. I don't mean that it's they're intending to be more motivated. Yeah. Now that's when we tie into what's really happening in the brain.
Yeah.
Because something else is giving them the dopamine hit that their brain is seeking to actually engage them in a way that whatever they're not doing is not engaging them.
Or nothing is giving them a dopamine hit, and so they're in neutral.
Right.
Especially in the education world, but I think also for parents, we talk so much about wanting our kids to feel intrinsically motivated to do things. Yeah. Which is kind of this pie in the sky. The bottom line is we should just recognize the fact that there are actually very few things in life that any of us do that we are truly exclusively intrinsically motivated to do.
Right.
Add to that, Emily, and I don't know, I'm not a developmental psychologist, so I don't know the official date that this happens, but we don't, as humans, develop intrinsic motivation until a pretty significant level of maturity, like I would say 18 to 23 maybe. And if you've got a child with executive function delays, so that they're, 3 to 5 years behind their peers, they may be 3 to 5 years behind their peers in terms of that part of the brain that develops intrinsic motivation. So you may have kids who may not have that capability even until they're in their late 20s.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it's not, most of us, you said this, don't really do it because of intrinsic things. We do it because we want to cross that off the list, or we want to be done with it, or we want to please our partners, or whatever there's always something in there that's a motivation for most of us.
And the other thing that tends to happen is that we look at intrinsic motivation from a moral lens.
Yes.
And so if they're not intrinsically motivated, then they must be fill in the blank. They must not have good character. They must not have a work ethic. They must, again, you can make up all kinds of things that we can put this judgment or assessment on the behavior and interpret the behavior based on whatever our values are that they're not meeting, instead of understanding that there's actually a brain wiring thing that's going on that's making it difficult for them to activate to do whatever's being expected.
Well, and Elaine, that reminds me of a concept we teach called the just get it done button. There's a slight difference between intrinsic motivation and the just get it done button, but the idea behind the just get it done button is that in a neuronormative brain, if there's no motivation, you can just say, okay, I'm going to figure out how to get this done.
I'm going to press the button.
I'm going to press the button and get it done. And that in the neurodiverse brain, dopamine is needed. And so you have to do something to create the dopamine, and motivation is one of the things that creates dopamine in the brain, which enables it to be easier to do things that are non-preferred things, right? That's really what we're talking about, is how to get the brain to do something that's not preferred.
Some of the things I hear you talking about here are closely related to executive functioning skills. Not that that's the only thing that can stand in the way for what might appear to be a motivation or a lack thereof. I'm wondering if you can help identify specifically some of the executive functioning skills that impact, either positively or negatively, what looks externally like motivation. What are some of the things that kind of impact that?
If we look at the executive functions, I mean, the one I mentioned was working memory, right? It's this sort of, so I have a hard time remembering that I didn't already walk the dog today, right? And so that might look like I'm not motivated to walk the dog, but the reality is that I have working memory issues. I might have
activation issues. So it's hard to get started to do something or to stick with something.
Or distraction management.
Right. I could have challenges with regulating my impulses, my inhibition. So I could have action issues.
I could have issues with prioritization. So it's kind of like I try to do 17 things before I get out the door to go pick up my kid from school. And so then I'm late to get my kid from school. And that doesn't mean I'm not motivated to get there on time. It just means that I have a hard time prioritizing and I'm trying to do too much in too little time.
I could have emotion regulation issues, which means when my mom asks me one more time, did you do that thing? I blow up and I'm upset because I feel bad about myself that I didn't do it and I'm not regulating my emotion very well. But my mom thinks I'm being rude and disrespectful.
And then I go into a shame cycle,
right,
which makes it even harder for me to do the thing that I wanted to do. And I go crawl in my cave, probably.
Yeah.
So these are just a few examples, but you can see how if you're not paying attention to what might make it hard for them to do something in the first place, then you might miss that it's not about motivation.
So the most common technique that people with neurodiversity, I think, or executive function challenges use to manage motivation challenges in this way, the most common way that they tend to get themselves to do the stuff they've got to do that they don't want to do is what we call urgency or hurry up. And that's waiting for the last minute, right? And by waiting for the last minute, your brain switches to a different part of your brain. You're no longer operating from the sentient part of the brain that humans have, but you're operating from the primitive part of the brain that says, there is a saber-toothed tiger at the door of the cave, and I better get action going now. I got to do something. And so that could be, I have to start getting dressed to go to school, or I have to start getting my homework done to turn it in. Or, it could be, I have to do the chores my mom asked. I got to stop and come down to dinner, whatever it is. Waiting till the last minute is actually a way of waiting until a different part of our brain kicks in to get us going. And it's not actually a bad strategy. I hate to demonize it. It's a legitimate strategy. It's just very, very overused in the community of neurodiversity because it's often the only strategy people know to tap into, even if they're not doing it consciously.
Well, and it's the flip side of urgency, and that's why we call it hurry up, is actually what we were talking about earlier, which is fear, right? It's a sort of, if I'm afraid that I'm going to be late, if I'm afraid I'm going to get in trouble, if I'm afraid, whatever, that same sort of, it's an amygdala stimulation. And so then the amygdala is what gets us over the hump of the dopamine. It's like we're putting cortisol in instead of dopamine, which is like, oh my gosh, I'm going to get in trouble. This is why so many of us, when we were kids, were able to navigate behaviors because we were afraid of getting into trouble, right? And so it's, again, don't demonize it, but just know that there are other tools in the toolbox. And this particular tool creates stress in the body, which is ultimately not sustainable over time and can end up with a lot of other side effects. So we teach 5 motivators, and hurry up is the 5th one. Elaine, do you want to go through the other 4?
Yeah. So, and I started there because I think that it's so commonly used. Right? That people really do, they have a way to get stuff done, and that way to get stuff done is often to rely on fear or wait to the last minute. So last minute is also a fear response. So the other motivators that we've identified over the years and we've learned from other people and we've kind of cultivated, the acronym we use for this is called PINCH. And what we've found in working with families is that if you can help parents and teachers and counselors understand these frameworks for motivation, you can actually teach this to kids really easily at a very young age because it's relatable. And so you can actually enroll kids in learning to identify their motivation instead of blaming them for not being motivated.
P is for play. And play is about being lighthearted. It might be about humor. It might be gamification. It might be creativity, like the kid who loves to have the crazy planner with all the colors and the tabs and everything else versus the standard planner that comes from the school. Or somebody who, it's the having fun while you're trying to do the chores. I mean, all of those sorts of things that make things lighter, which creates the dopamine, which helps the brain to get things accomplished.
So for some kids, that might be allowing them to choose their own topic before writing or finding a creative spin in it. For some kids, that might be putting a basketball hoop over the laundry hamper so they can throw the laundry in. My favorite story was the time I needed my kids to go to the grocery store to take care of something during a stressful time in the family. My oldest was 16, and I kind of went to them and I said, would you please take your siblings and go to the grocery store? We really need you to do this. And they looked at them and they looked at me and they looked at them and they looked at me and they looked back at their siblings and they said, okay, everybody, superheroes to the grocery store. And these kids put on capes and tights and shorts over the tights, the whole bit. And that's what my eldest needed to motivate themselves to get their siblings out into the grocery store, right? So it was just, let's make this fun. Let's make this playful. So that's the P. But a lot of things are included in that P. As Diane mentioned, humor, being playful, light, funny, making a joke about things, that can be a really powerful way to engage motivation.
So I is interest. And I guess as we say this, Elaine, we should be really clear that not everybody is motivated by all of these, but what we're looking for, or in any moment, but it's about the curiosity of what is it that motivates me? What is it that motivates my kid? What is it that motivates my students? Kind of depending on what lens you're wearing as you're listening to us. So I is interest. If I'm genuinely interested in something, it's going to be easier for me to get the motivation that's needed to accomplish it. So the example, Elaine, you gave was like if a child is allowed to write a book report on a book that they choose, as opposed to everybody's going to write a book about Robert E. Lee or whoever it happens to be, right? It's that interest in this topic is going to engage them in the content in a very different way.
And what we see with kids who are motivated by interest, you can tell because these are the kids who do well for some teachers, but not others, right? Or well in some subjects, but not others. And it's not that they're not bright enough to grasp it. It's because this subject matter is more interesting to me. Like I had a kid who was fine. He was really smart and he was great in sciences, but he didn't really like them. But man, was he interested in history, right? And so I had one kid who was really, really hated math all throughout school. But there was one teacher one year where that kid got straight A's in math.
Right.
All year round.
Right.
No, I had one of those in science. It's like a sort of definitely not a science kid. But then that one year, something about this teacher just threw them into the ring. And they were like, science is cool, Mom. And I'm like, yeah, it is.
So cultivating what's fascinating, really tapping into what really is fascinating about it to them. I was talking to one of my kids recently, who's a young adult now, who was trying to get himself to get a boring job for the holidays. And we were talking about, what's the motivation? And when we told him you could go work at whatever it was, and you might be able to use a box cutter, he's like, box cutters are interesting. It's like, that would be fun.
That's all it takes.
Okay, so the N stands for novelty. And a lot of our kids are novelty seekers. And that's, we joke about shiny objects, right? Distractibility. Squirrel, right? But novelty is about, I like things to be changing and new and different. And like, I have a job with a lot of novelty. I'm constantly doing different things. That's a big motivation for me. I could have systems that work great. And at some point, I might get bored with them and I might need to change them, even though they work great. because I got to shake things up sometimes. Novelty is, for a lot of us, is really important to just keep the brain engaged.
The kids who do really well at the beginning of the semester.
Yes.
And then by like midterms, they're like, okay, I'm done.
I'm done.
I've had too much right now. But it's so, and then the beginning of the next semester, they're raring to go again.
Right. Because they like the new teachers or the new classes or the new paper, materials or the new, whatever. I used to have one kid who would come to me, a couple months in and say, I'm done. And I finally figured this out, and I'd start to say, good job, you made it a couple of weeks further than last year. Well done. Because that's real for them. That's why some of our kids in elementary years do much better when they get to middle school. You're worried that they're not going to be able to organizationally handle it, but the changing of classes and teachers is actually the stimulation they need to really engage differently.
Yeah.
So novelty is really important for some people. My favorite story about novelty, and this is true, is I keep 2 or 3 toothpastes, about 3 toothpastes and 2 or 3 toothbrushes in my bathroom drawer. So that every day it's a little game of roulette to decide what I'm going to use. Do I feel like minty today or floral today? And that little bit of novelty, helps.
I think the point that you're making here too, though, is that it doesn't take a lot to make it novel.
No.
It can be something little. Like, again, so taking that example with the toothbrushes and the toothpaste, like maybe it's just about choosing which pen you're going to use for your assignment or, something like it doesn't have to be reinventing the wheel.
And you're adding another piece to that, which is like choosing, like that agency. We have a whole other episode where we can talk about that. But it's like, I get to choose which pen I'm going to use. Oh, awesome. I have some choice in this. That in itself is another piece that can be very motivating for us as humans.
The C gets a little complicated. We've expanded the C in Pinch over the years. It started off with the C was
competition.
And over the years, I've grown to see that the C is competition. It's also collaboration, right? There's connection. There's something that's about you in relation to others that can be a really strong motivator. I have a 27-year-old who's in graduate school and was asking about trying to get some help to find another way to get motivated besides studying with their friends, because that's been such a motivator all of their lives that they really don't have a lot of other ways that have worked for them. So it's a whole new exploration because it's that connection, that camaraderie. Sometimes the competition is competition with self, but very often it's not competition. It's about camaraderie and connection.
And sometimes it is about competition. I mean, this is when in school systems, it's like, okay, if we can all sit quiet, we can get Skittles at the end of the week, right? It's this sort of, that is competition at its finest. And the thing to pay attention to, particularly with competition, is your kids with anxiety.
Yes.
Because a lot of times that will shut them down completely. And so they're not engaging effectively because they're afraid of getting it wrong or they're afraid of coming in second or whatever it is that they're afraid of. So,
yeah.
I love this. One of the things I'll sometimes share is, so when I've been writing my books, one of the things that I will do is I'll do like a Pomodoro, so setting a timer for a certain amount of time. But what I also do while that timer is going is I tabulate how many words I've written during that window of time. And then I get a spreadsheet out and then I put how many words and then I see if I can beat that the next time.
Yes.
I would lie to myself. I'd be like, oh yeah, well, did you really do 47 or did you do 48?
And my kid would be highly motivated by that. I totally get that.
Yeah.
So it's about helping when we take Pinch. And so H, as we talked about, was hurry up or urgency. That's the first one we talked about, which is kind of relying on a different part of the brain to get something done. So all of these, when you look at Pinch, what we're really talking about is understanding what jazzes you enough to engage you enough to do the stuff that might otherwise not be so interesting. Or even if it is interesting, that might feel hard or effortful, because that's the other thing that I think shuts people down a lot. It's not that I can't get started. It's that I know this is going to be hard and I'm not sure I have the energy to do the hard right now.
I really love this. I think that hopefully this is also just helping people think about not only how do you structure the requests or the tasks or the environment, whatever it might be, to help a child who's struggling with showing that motivation,
right,
even though they may be motivated, but they're having a hard time engaging with that. And also just give some ways to even communicate about it as well, hopefully with kids and get their buy-in.
I remember a story Diane told, and this is so Diane and I have been working together doing this work for over 13 years, for a long time. And when her son was, I want to say he was 10.
Second grade, I think.
When she said something about some math assignment, what do you need to do? And he said to her, Mom, I need a motivator.
That's the backstory is, and I think that the punchline I like to tell in this is like, part of this is talking to our kids about the role of motivation. And the story was like, he had 50 math problems. We divided them in 2 nights. He had 25 a night. The first night he was done in 20 minutes. The second night it took 2.5 hours. And it's like, afterwards I was like, dude, what happened? And he said, Mom, my show was on last night. And I was like, oh, so there was motivation for you to get done within a certain time, blah, blah, blah. And it enabled us to have a whole different conversation. So it's not that the math is harder. It's not that you're more lazy or tired or anything else. It's literally, if there's a motivation there, it's easier for you to get the stuff done. And so then it could be, what do you want to do to motivate yourself? Or, I need a motivator.
Yeah. I love that. I always think that the explicit conversations with kids about what's really happening and getting away from the shoulds, you should be able to do this, you should do that, but just really exploring that not only helps us understand our kids, but helps them develop their own self-awareness so that they can be more independent as time really goes by. So, Elaine and Diane, this has been such a really great conversation. As we wrap up, this brings us to our final question. I'm going to bring it back to that pinch piece that you were talking about. So, play, interest, novelty, competition, collaboration, or connection for the C, and then hurry up is the H. If you had a parent who is struggling to find ways to really engage with their child to help them with this motivation piece here, what would you want them to hear about what next steps to take as they support their child? How could they just start the initial tasks of integrating that idea of pinch or maybe something else that kind of aligns with that? What would you want them to hear?
Where I would start is twofold. One is just even having the conversation, which is what I was just describing, looking for the opportunity to talk about the role that motivation plays. And the second piece of it is like not having to get it right. Right? This is experimentation. One of the things we didn't explicitly say is that just because you happen to be a novelty person doesn't mean that all the time your brain is interested in novelty. I mean, every day your brain may be inspired by something different. And so if we put the pressure on to find out the thing that motivates our kid, it may change over time. But if it's, okay, let's play with this a little bit. Let's experiment. Let's see what we notice if we set a timer. Let's see what we notice if we create a reward system. Let's see what we notice if we do our homework in the garage instead of in the office, whatever it is. But you're building in the different things and paying attention more like an experimenter does, rather than I got to figure this out so you can get your homework done, right? That's what I would say, Elaine. What would you add?
A couple of things come to mind. One is if you've got a kid who's struggling with neurodiversity in a lot of different forms, keep in mind that you're likely to have to help them find a motivation to do almost anything and everything. Okay. I still find a motivation to brush my teeth, and I'm a grown adult, right? So understand that that's just the reality of it. That's the way our brains are wired. The other thing that really jumps out at me, playing on what you were talking about, Diane, we teach, in our world, what we do is teach neurodiversity-informed coaching skills to parents, right? Because we became coaches, we became better parents, so we teach coaching skills. And there's a coaching skill called transparency. And that's about being really open and vulnerable and not having to know it or get it right. Kids love it when their parents are transparent and vulnerable because that cultivates a sense of trust and safety, and it challenges their own tendency towards perfectionism. So it's really healthy for them when you're transparent. So you have an opportunity to say, hey, I learned something today in this podcast I was listening to. Can I share it with you? I think it's really cool. I'd never thought about this before. So if you take the experimenter's mind that Diane's talking about and you really share with them that you're learning too, that, let me write this down for you. It's called pinch. I bet you won't be able to guess what these are, like however you want to play with them. But to introduce it from a framework of this is new to me too. And I'm fascinated by it and I want to share it with you. That enrolls them in the conversation instead of trying to tell them. So one of the things we talk about, another coaching technique, is to ask, don't tell. If you ask the question, are you interested, instead of telling them, I learned something today, I want to teach you this. They don't want you to teach you this. Right? They just don't. So ask a question that enrolls them to be curious with you.
I love that.
Elaine, there's another thing you said in passing that I want to reiterate as a parent who doesn't identify as neurodiverse, is the role of motivation is crucial, right? And this was this light bulb that went off for me. It's like, parents say this all the time. I don't want to have to pay my kids to do their homework. I don't want to have to pay it's like this sort of, and that is literally what their brain needs, and not to be paid, but needs motivation. And so let's not make it wrong that our kids require motivation to get even stupid stuff done. Especially this easy stuff is the hard stuff to get done. But if we just say, you know what, it is absolutely critical that there's some motivation in there, the brain just literally can't get it done. It can't prioritize, it can't get started. Whatever some of those challenges are of executive function, it's almost like you're greasing the skids. The motivation is part of what helps the brain to do the hard stuff in a very different way. And so I want to make sure we reiterate that, because it's easy to forget, because those of us who have just get it done buttons, it just gets done.
Yeah. Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster, thank you both so much for your time today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Emily.
I love the framework we talked about during the interview that is used to motivate neurodivergent brains. One of my favorite tools to integrate novelty is gamification. Gamification can be used in so many different ways, whether we're using it in our classrooms to help engage our students or for ourselves to feel motivated to get chores done around the house. My favorite inexpensive tool to help with gamification are Dungeons & Dragons dice. There are dice with up to 20 sides, and there are so many different ways to use them. Are you having a hard time getting started on something? Roll the D20. D stands for dice, 20 represents the number of sides, to determine how many minutes you're going to start working on something. If at the end of that time you aren't feeling it, you have permission to stop, or if you find yourself in the zone, you're allowed to keep going. Not sure what to do next? Grab the D6 and assign each number a different task. Roll the die and let it choose your next step. Be sure to allow one of the sides to be a freebie where you can do nothing or do a preferred activity. Sometimes the universe wants you to relax. There are so many creative ways to integrate gamification into our daily lives. Marketing companies have been doing it forever, and our brains are wired for it. When we tie that with the mundane things for the day-to-day, we can hijack that little part of our brains that relies on a dopamine kick to get things rolling along. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again to Elaine Taylor-Klaus and Diane Dempster for joining us. We have links to their work in the show notes, so check it out. Also, while you're there, don't forget there are links to pre-order the new book. What's the name of that again, Em?
Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, Transforming Practices so all students feel accepted and supported.
Yeah, that's it. From Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and Target. Also, find links to our Facebook page and group where you can keep the conversation going about this episode or any of the other 248 episodes we've done so far. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our music is from Epidemic Sound. Our website is neurodiversitypodcast.com. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance,